It's not a controversial statement to say Shadow of the Colossus is one of the best games ever made. With its imaginative approach to gameplay and mysterious plot, the game has definitely left a mark on the minds of most people who've played it. There seems to be two extremes in the spectrum of what players look for in their single-player games. There are those who value gameplay above all else, and those to whom the story is the most interesting aspect of the medium, and I imagine most people fall somewhere in between. The success of Shadow of the Colossus can probably be attributed to how the game works well both mechanically and narratively, and in doing so scratches the itch of most kinds of gamers, even if the lack of traditional enemies can be a turn-off for some. However, unlike NICO, where plot and gameplay were intrinsically linked, some would even say to the detriment of the gameplay, Shadow of the Colossus seems to provide a more segregated experience in that regard. So the question this presents is, since the gameplay isn't as essential to the plot, could Shadow of the Colossus work on a different media? Could we perhaps separate the story of Wonder from the gameplay of the work without the lack of one diminishing the other's quality? This, in turn, opens up even bigger questions on whether a game even needs to integrate gameplay and story. If both are of high quality, then it stands to reason that the experience should be of high quality as well. However, that line of thought leaves us with games that essentially are comprised of game parts and story parts, both existing separated from each other in a way that one could be removed entirely without affecting the other. The same way removing the cinematography from a good movie will negatively impact the story, perhaps a true masterpiece in the realm of gaming should be one where all parts work together to create something greater. With this in mind, is Shadow of the Colossus a gaming masterpiece? I think a lot of people would say yes, myself included, but if that is so, then what keeps it from being merely two separate works, one of literature and another of gaming, bundled in a single package? What elements work towards bridging the gap between gameplay and story? That is the question this video will attempt to answer. As usual, this video will contain spoilers and is better understood if you've played the game, so you've been warned. The story of Wonder begins with the death of Mono and his inability to let go of her. Be it motivated by love, guilt, or duty, Wonder is holding on to something that he has lost but wishes to get back. Meanwhile, the gameplay consists of climbing the colossi while looking for places to rest so that Wonder's grip gauge won't deplete. Falling down isn't as dangerous as you would think, since fall damage is pretty minimal, but since the enemies usually require some sort of puzzle solving before Wonder can get back on their backs, there is a big incentive to cling to them as hard as you can. While interpreting the mechanics, some people have drawn a connection between the idea of holding on to Mono and the central mechanic of holding on to a Colossus. However, I'm not sure I am a fan of this interpretation because there's an obvious difference between the feeling of not being able to let go of an important person in your life and the feeling of not wanting to fall off the back of a giant. If we're willing to look at Ueda's previous game, one potentially interesting thing to note is how the button to hold on is the same one used to hold Yorda's hand in NICO. This creates another possible link between the climbing mechanics and the loss of a companion, at least for those who have played that game before. So technically we found some mechanics that link the gameplay to the story, but they seem tenuous for most of the game and perhaps even misguided if the intent really was to relate the inability to let go with the desire to not fall during combat. In some ways, the manner in which this plot relates to the game's core mechanic reminds me of Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. For those who don't know, the main mechanic from that game is being able to turn back time for a few seconds in order to correct any miscalculated jumps or mistakes in combat. The story then relates itself to this mechanic by being framed as a redemption story for the prince, so both are about correcting mistakes. When we look at the work as a whole, the gameplay doesn't necessarily elevate the story in any meaningful way, but it creates a sense of thematic cohesion for the game. If you allow me to speculate a little, Shadow of the Colossus' plot feels like it was written with this approach in mind, especially considering it began production as a multiplayer game about killing colossi and was only later turned into a single-player story-driven experience. To me, it looks as if they simply wrote a story around the idea of hanging on because it was the core mechanic they retained from the original concept. The reason it feels less successful here than in Sands of Time is because, as I said before, hanging on for your life is not the same as hanging on to a deceased loved one. I know I said a few minutes ago that I do believe Shadow of the Colossus is a game that manages to combine gameplay and story, only to immediately show how it does so in a poor manner. But the thing is, it's actually not done poorly at all, we're just looking at it from the wrong perspective. Because it's in the final moment of interactivity where the purpose of the climbing mechanic as a storytelling device becomes apparent. Here the connection between the theme and the mechanic of hanging on becomes a lot more tangible and acceptable, as you can try to hold on to the stairs or jump towards Mono, but it's futile. The fatal inevitability of things finally catches up to Wonder, and the mechanics expertly convey this feeling. It's a twist in the use of the game's mechanics that forces you to re-evaluate everything you thought the game was trying to show its players, at least from a ludonarrative perspective. In a sense, everything leads to this moment. Fumito Ueda has stated, quote, "Throughout the game, the primary action control was hanging on to the Colossus for all the battles. But I do like the fact that we used this action control for something important, something other than battles at the very end of the game. It's almost like all the battles with the Colossi leading up to this scene were just a prelude so that we could successfully portray this very last hang-on action." Unquote. With this idea in mind, the mechanic of hanging on seems to emphasize a bigger theme of futility or inevitability. And in hindsight, we can see it being explored in various places during the campaign. The self-fulfilling aspect of Mono's curse is one good example in terms of the story, but we also feel it through the gameplay every time we defeat a Colossus. The first time this happens, you could be fooled into thinking you did something wrong, or that you somehow could have escaped the darkness. This is where the repetitive nature of the game helps the theme become more apparent. On the first few Colossi, players might try different techniques to try and run away, but eventually the futility of these attempts will hit them. How each player reacts to this realization is up to the individual. Some might embrace the inevitability of it and give up, while others will defiantly try to fight it to the very last moment. Either way, the game makes us experience the tragedy of the events in a very powerful manner. The dark tendrils that attack Wonder's body could have been shown in a cutscene, and the same is true for the sequence where he fails to reach Mono at the end. But the game wants players to grasp the relevant themes of the work through their own experience. In constructing these scenarios, the team must have put a lot of thought into how to portray this feeling correctly. Players need to believe that they stand a chance to actually outmaneuver the shadows, or to reach Mono, or even still, to stop Emon from leaving the temple. I think what truly sells these moments is how they aren't 100% scripted, as players have means of delaying the inevitable results. For example, the farther you run from the tendrils, the longer they will take to get to you. Or if you hit Amon's men while controlling Dorman, they will stumble and delay their escape. I think the fact that there are so many rumors about what could possibly happen if the player achieved any of these goals is a testament to Team NICO's success in this regard. The theme of futility is not only portrayed in the story, but it is also felt by the player in these key moments, and as a result, the tragic and melancholic atmosphere of the game permeates its entirety. Despite being a very quiet and lonely game, Shadow of the Colossus sports a surprisingly big number of characters compared to its younger and older siblings. And each one of them has a distinct purpose towards establishing one of the themes of the story, so let's go through them one by one. If we had to come up with a single word to describe Wonder's character, it would probably be determination. His quest to bring Mono back to life is his driving motivation, and he's willing to put himself in absurdly dangerous situations to see it through. The animation plays an important part in selling us Wonder's struggle. Through the way he slowly picks himself up after a heavy attack, to the way he stumbles while traversing the Colossus' backs, and even the awkward way he swings his sword, the game establishes him as a normal man instead of fulfilling some sort of power fantasy, which honestly would not be hard to imagine given the game's premise. The things Wonder is shown to be good at are horseback riding and archery, and through these actions it's possible to infer some interpretations of what role Wonder used to play in his society, as he seems to be more of a hunter than a warrior in the strict sense of the word. His clothes also share similarities with Lord Ammon's attire, which could also lead to further speculation. However, these questions about Wonder's origins are not nearly as interesting as the debate on whether he should be described as a selfless or selfish person. On one hand, as the animations show, he's clearly risking life and limb to save a person he cares about, while on the other hand, as we come to learn in the end, he's also meddling in things beyond his comprehension and perhaps causing more harm than good. For one example of how Wonder's unwavering resolve could lead to bad consequences, we can turn to Aggro. It may seem weird to analyze the character traits of a horse, but believe me, there's actually some interesting aspects to her. Aggro's defining trait is obviously loyalty, but the most interesting aspect of it is how the game builds her as an independent character in order to sell her characterization, because everything is done through the gameplay. Aggro doesn't just stay where Wonder leaves her, she explores and does what she wants, but never fails to come to him when called for. When riding, she steers herself away from cliffs and obstacles and doesn't always respond to Wonder's commands. The controls themselves help solidify her as an independent entity, because unlike horses in Zelda games for example, the player doesn't have full control over her just because the avatar is on her back. Unlike Epona, pressing forward won't move her forward. The only controls you have over Aggro is to tell her to go and steering her left and right, much like what your options would be in real life. The idea of having a partner with a mind of her own lends a lot of weight to simple things, like the way she always comes back to the shrine of worship looking for Wonder, despite the dangers she's put through on his behalf. Even after her sacrifice before the final Colossus, she still returns to the temple looking for him. Because she feels independent from the player, her loyalty is all the more admirable, and is probably the reason players connect with her so much. To the point a lot of people think the game is more about Wonder's relationship with Aggro than anything else, similar to how NICO is about the relationship with Yorda. Mono doesn't get much characterization on account of being dead for the duration of the game, but one interesting thing to consider is how we hear her voice every time Wonder is being brought back to the shrine. According to Fumito Ueda, she's asking him to stop his quest. With that in mind, Mono gains greater significance when compared against the Colossi. Is her life worth the death of all of these creatures? Perhaps she doesn't think so because they have a degree of innocence to them. Some are mostly passive, and even when they attack, it's hard not to attribute it as an act of self-preservation rather than actual malice. Perhaps in sacrificing these colossi to get what he wants, Wonder is only perpetuating a cycle of violence. By now you may have noticed how the theme of sacrifice permeates these characters. In a sense, Shadow of the Colossus' plot could easily be read as an exploration on the different facets of sacrifice. Mono is sacrificed for having a cursed fate, which is very ironic considering that this is the catalyst for Wonder performing the forbidden spell to bring back Dorman. Looking at it in this manner is what seems to imply Mono's curse is some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy like I mentioned earlier. The Colossi being slaughtered at Dorman's request is not dissimilar to the idea of sacrificing animals to appease the gods. Of course, from the player's point of view, it's initially portrayed with a complete disregard for the creatures and simply as a means to an end, just like any other game. But this is gradually subverted as their numbers shrink. Wonder embarks on a journey of self-sacrifice willingly, but for arguably selfish reasons, which contrasts with Agro, who ends up sacrificing herself for him in an act of loyalty. Both end up giving their lives in attempts to save someone they care about, but one does it for virtuous reasons, while the other is a lot more self-centered. We still haven't discussed Emon and Dorman, which could constitute the perspective of those who demand sacrifice. In regards to the former, we can't say for sure whether he was the one who ordered Mono to be killed, but it's an easy interpretation to make judging by the way he's upholding the rules Wonder aims to break. He's a religious leader and can be interpreted as a showcase of how a dogmatic point of view can lead to greater tragedies. Speaking of religion, the name Dorman seems to be a reference to Nimrod, the grandson of Noah, who according to some scholars was the king responsible for the construction of the Tower of Babel. For anyone who's not familiar, the goal of the Tower of Babel was to build a structure to reach the heavens in an attempt to prevent another great flood and essentially keep God in check. Obviously, this angered the Judeo-Christian God, who in turn created the different languages to confuse mankind and stop the construction. In some versions of this story, Nimrod was killed and buried in 16 different locations. It's easy to spot the similarities between the shrine of worship and the tower itself, and Nimrod's death seems like an exact parallel to Dorman's imprisonment. If we look at the game's ending, we can also see imagery evocative of the Garden of Eden and a virgin birth. Personally, I don't see much meaning to be drawn by comparing the Bible to this game's plot, but considering Shadow of the Colossus is a prequel to NICO, I feel like Ueda might have borrowed these elements in an attempt to give the story the unique kind of quality present in creation myths and religious texts. But this is just my interpretation. There is certainly a lot to sink your teeth into if you think there's greater significance to these references. Going back to Dorman, they are a deity that demands the sacrifice of the Colossi as well as the sacrifice of Wonder, which puts them in a pretty unlikable position, but when all is said and done, they keep their part of the bargain by reviving Mono. Dorman exemplifies how the world of Shadow of the Colossus doesn't always frame actions in a black and white manner. There's a certain honesty to their actions that you would not expect based on their appearance and implied goal. After all, Dorman warns Wonder that the price would be high and that he would be breaking the law of mortals. In keeping their promise, Dorman further complicates the events of an already complex situation, and the question of who the real villain of the work is becomes entirely a matter of perspective. The player's journey through Shadow of the Colossus is one that is filled with contrast, not least of which is the difference in size between the player avatar and his enemies. The game's unrivaled sense of scale sits at its core to be sure, but the entire rest of the game also seems to operate with these sorts of binaries. The gameplay loop is segregated into two distinct and diametrically opposed segments: horseback riding and combat. While the former is tranquil and contemplative with no music to speak of, the latter is hectic and chaotic and sports a fully orchestrated soundtrack. Finding the Colossi is never harder than a light platforming challenge or some dark section of the path that might make you lose your sense of direction for a while, and even then, they still present some amazing vistas which emphasize a more internalized experience with minimal player input. Meanwhile, the fights themselves may vary in difficulty, but they always ask the player to solve some unique puzzle just so they can start climbing the creature. From there, it becomes a struggle to maintain the grip gauge from depleting without falling off. It's certainly a lot more intense. Contrast is also prevalent in the game's aesthetics. For every new shadow figure around Wonder, we can also find a new white dove around Mono. As Wonder's appearance deteriorates, Mono becomes livelier and her voice becomes clearer. Ueda's signature bloom lighting reinforces the contrast between darkly lit areas and the blinding natural light. Dorman themselves embody the traditional male-female duality, and even the tendrils that come out of a Colossus' body seem to contain both a light and a dark aspect to them. before Bluepoint decided to change it for some reason. Anyways, speaking of dead colossi, the conflicting emotions of triumph and guilt over a successful encounter could be read as another way the game uses contrast in its most crucial moments. There's a debate to be had about whether it's fair when a game forces the player to do something bad, only to call them out later on being evil, but I feel like Shadow of the Colossus avoids this trap by allowing players to notice things on their own and come to their own conclusions. The game never explicitly states that you should feel guilty over your actions, but it's a pretty common reaction among those who've played it. It's interesting how the game operates almost entirely through these black and white opposites, because on a broader level we can see how this forms a bigger contrast with the story itself, which operates in a more gray area. This contrast is important for the game to sell you on the complicated nature of the events, as it tricks you into believing this will be a traditional good versus evil love story where the hero will save the girl, only to gradually tear down any preconceived moral notions about this world. If the melancholic music, dark tendrils, and shadowy figures fail to signal to players that this is not a traditional good versus evil story, some of the colossi themselves also carry elements to convey this idea. Colossus 2 howls in pain. Colossus 5 never attacks until provoked. Colossus 11 shows fear. And Colossus 13 literally does nothing but fly aimlessly around. It doesn't even attack you at all. Then there's the segment we play as Dorman, where the gameplay tries to show us how, despite being enormous creatures, the colossi are also cumbersome and slow. Through this role reversal, we can start to imagine the desperation of these creatures when facing wonder, and start to truly sympathize with their struggle. The lens through which we experience events changes our perceptions of right and wrong. All it takes is a change in perspective. Because Shadow of the Colossus is aware of this fact, it takes an opposite approach to what NICO tried to do, in the sense that you're not really supposed to feel like wonder. We play as him because he is the driving force for the plot, but we don't necessarily have to agree with his actions. We can never truly understand Wonder, because he has a clearly defined backstory that we don't know, pre-existing relationships with Amon and Mono that we also don't know much about, not to mention prior knowledge about the nature of Dorman. It's worth mentioning that this is the only Fumito Ueda game where we see a cutscene where the main character is not involved at all, when Amon is approaching the Forbidden Lands. Wonder has no knowledge of this, but the player does, further adding to the list of things that one knows and the other doesn't. This creates an obvious disconnect. You could argue that NICO also has a backstory that we never get to see, but the only part that has any influence on the plot of that game are the horns, and they are explained as early as logically possible. NICO's driving motivation is just to escape and save a helpless girl, not really much to debate there, whereas Wonder's actions are much more questionable, which makes the omission of a clear backstory all the more jarring. This is another way Shadow of the Colossus avoids the possible trap of blaming you for what it forces you to do. By not actually placing you in the character's shoes, it lets you disagree with his actions without taking you out of the experience. The presence of a HUD is nothing noteworthy by itself until you compare it with Ueda's other games. I could be reading too much into it, but this could be supporting evidence for the idea of keeping players from fully embracing wonder as a proxy for themselves in the game world. Shadow of the Colossus wants you to look at the events from a distance to allow for critical thinking. This distance is what allows the game to jump from Wonder's perspective to Dorman's perspective and back to Wonder's in a much more natural manner. One of the scrapped optional items was going to be the Eye of the Colossus, which would allow players to see the Colossus' perspective during combat. That seems to reinforce this idea of different points of view being a core theme for the game, especially considering we know it wasn't cut due to any artistic decisions, but instead due to technical limitations. The hawk at the beginning can be easily associated with Wonder's hunt or some other spiritual meaning, but to me it always stood as a symbolic representation of the player. We arrive and leave the story with this hawk, and it reinforces this notion that we're seeing things play out from a distance, unable to change the events and never knowing the full story. This much mystery in the plot runs the risk of coming across as needlessly vague, but it actually serves a function for the story of Shadow of the Colossus. Without the backstory, there's no way for us to rationalize the events. We must take only what is presented and judge it according to our own morals. For every argument defending Wonder, there's one to be made defending Iman, and ultimately we can't know who's right or wrong if there even is such a thing. The game asks the questions and expects players to come up with their own answers. How you read these events ends up saying something about you. Do you see Iman as a religious zealot or as a peacekeeper? Do you think Wonder is a selfish murderer or a tragic hero? Is Dorming a just deity for keeping their promise, or are they evil for using Wonder even if he did accept the price? In the end, it's up to each one of us to come up with our own answers. Shadow of the Colossus may not be as focused on a single vision like NICO was, but it's arguably a better game for it. As a piece of art meant to be interpreted, it presents a lot of elements and lets players come up with their own interpretations about the events. I've talked about themes of sacrifice, morality, and inevitability in this analysis, but others have read the game through the lens of environmentalism or religion. Its gameplay might not be in tune with its plot as much as NICO was, but there are still moments that are powerful precisely because of their interactivity. The bond with Agro is made stronger by the controls. Wonder's inability to let go is felt when we try to reach Mono. The innocence of the Colossi is apparent when the game puts us in their shoes. And the repetitive gameplay loop allows us to come to the realization of Wonder's actions at a very personal pace, something that probably wouldn't work the same way in a different medium. Interactivity might not be telling the story, but it's certainly elevating it. I'm sorry for comparing games to movies again, but in some ways Shadow of the Colossus reminds me of The Shining by Stanley Kubrick. Both have relatively simple plots when broken down to their basics, but the nuances and subtleties presented through the media in which they are portrayed allow for a vast array of different kinds of interpretations. Much like how The Shining can be a simple ghost story or an allegory about the massacre of Native Americans, depending on who you ask, Shadow of the Colossus also has interpretations varying from a simple tragedy to a discussion about morality through the lens of Kierkegaard. A lot of games like to present themselves as cryptic and vague in an attempt to come across as meaningful. So what I'm trying to say is that Shadow of the Colossus has the substance to justify being open to interpretation. The game's mysteries will remain forever enticing and compelling, even if we never come to a definitive conclusion.